Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's training industry webinar, The State of AI Practices in L&D, What Matters and What Doesn't Across the Organization. So I'm Liz Spate, the Events Marketing Specialist here at Training Industry, and I'm thrilled to have you with us here today. Before we get started, though, I would like to quickly go over a few housekeeping items to help you interact with our speaker and get the most out of today's program. So many of you have, but if you haven't done so already, let's open up those chat windows and let us know where you are joining us from today. As I mentioned, it's a pretty chilly day here in Raleigh, North Carolina, but it is a pleasure to have you all here with us. And while you're doing so, feel free to use this chat window to interact with our speaker with any comments. As for those questions, though, can you please put those in the Q&A section of our toolbar below? That will help make sure that we address all your questions, and we'll try to have some time left over end of day for this webinar. Additionally, we would also love to hear about what you've learned from today's session on social media, so please follow Adobe and hashtag TI webinars as you share your favorite takeaways with your colleagues. And when this webinar ends, you should receive a short evaluation survey. We always welcome your feedback on things like the content, speakers, topics, or anything else you would like to share with us, so be sure to complete that survey after the event. And as always, today's webinar will be recorded and archived on trainingindustry.com, and you will receive a follow-up email from us that will include the link to the on-demand program for you to share with your team. Now, if you've attended one of our programs in the past, thank you so much for joining us again. But if this is your first webinar with us, a big welcome goes out to you. At Training Industry, we offer dozens of webinars with subjects ranging from AI, analytics, to onboarding, upskilling, and reskilling. We cover about every topic relevant to training leaders and organizations around the globe. And now it is my pleasure to get us started. So here is our speaker for the day. Dr. Tom Whelan is the Director of Corporate Research at Training Industry. And prior to joining us, he has worked as an organizational consultant, designing and evaluating selection practices and training programs. And Tom has also published research in leading journals and presented at international conferences. He additionally holds a PhD in industrial organizational psychology from the North Carolina State University. And with that, take it away, Tom.
Thank you for that intro, Liz. All right, let me get my slides shared so we can get going. Okay, so hopefully the webinar that you came to attend today was called The State of AI Practices in L&D, What Matters and What Doesn't Across Organizations. In terms of what we're going to go through in this session, first we're going to talk a little bit about the state of practice of AI as it stands in 2025. Then we're going to get into answering the question, when does organizational size matter to AI practices? After that, we'll get into when does the industry or market of the organization matter? And we're going to answer both of those does it matter questions by looking at data across organizations, obviously, on how AI training gets defined, the general attitudes that learners have about AI, as well as the different L&D activities to which AI is being applied. So in other words, like what are the use cases? How might those differ across organizations? Then we'll end with some takeaways about the current reality of AI and L&D as I think we see it in light of the data that we're going to go over. And hopefully if I don't run my mouth for too long, we'll have some time for Q&A at the end and we can be done with this before the top of the hour and not go over. Okay, so let's get into things. So the state of practice in 2025. So thinking about this, one of the questions that occurred to me first is kind of like, why are we still here in a sense? Like AI isn't brand spanking new, so why are we still here? Why are we still talking about it? Why is it still relevant to conversations about business and training and all that kind of stuff? And it occurs to me because there's a lot of narratives out there about it. You know, so in a sense, why are we still here? Wasn't there supposed to be widespread job displacement? It was going to take all of our careers and rip them from our hands. And I mean, that hasn't happened. While there has been some automations that AIs have enabled, this idea of widespread job displacement hasn't really occurred. I think we're all still figuring out how to integrate AI into workflows in the best way that we can. Another narrative is, just the ravenous AI economy that has, kind of come into existence over the past couple of years. And while it's true that there's been massive investments in AI infrastructure, the impacts on bottom line and the promised, gains and productivity explosions and all that kind of stuff. It hasn't really materialized at scale, at least not to the degree that maybe we've been led to believe. Another thing, why are we still, wasn't there supposed to be, a regulatory firestorm around the use of AI? And while some of those discussions are going on, more what's happened is businesses have had time to adapt, and a lot of them are proactively kind of working through AI risks. So the huge regulation, either not putting a lid on things or clamping everything down so tightly that it's impossible to do anything, that really hasn't materialized either. Um, there's also this idea of cybersecurity helplessness, that as soon as we infect everything that we use with AI, everything's going to get ruined. And while we've seen, AI has been used in some cyber attacks, it's also strengthened defenses a lot. So that narrative doesn't really play either. Yeah, and then there's the kind of the age old, let's just resign ourselves to just welcoming the Terminator robots to come take us all out. And the reality is, a lot of the current systems that are being used are fairly narrow in capability and require a lot of human oversight. I was having dinner recently with two professionals that work in UX and do a lot of work with AI, and both of them have the same opinion that any AI is only as good as the people that put it together and that tested the model. So this idea that there's some rogue AI out there that's an existential threat to us all, it just that hasn't really come to pass either. Um, so I think the key word today is narratives. Like, what narratives do we believe about AI? I mean, all the ones on the screen are patently ridiculous. So really, why are we still here? If we get down to, what is going on between organizations? So is it that small businesses either aren't interested or they can't afford to get on board with some of these solutions? Another narrative that I've heard is medium-sized businesses are stuck in a gap of solution offerings. Like they're not quite big enough to really capitalize on the idea of taking advantage of what they can produce at scale with the use of AI. And at the same time, these medium-sized businesses are too big to use some applications that maybe would make sense at a smaller organization. Even though they're not interested and can't afford it. There's also this narrative that if you're talking to large companies, that pretty much they're all in on this concept of AI, and they're the ones that have all the budget for it, and nobody else does. Further narratives, you start to get in the industry. The AI is, everybody in the tech sector really loves it, and everywhere else it's sort of feared, or people aren't sure. Or that if you're in a physical or quote unquote low tech industry, that you don't really have a lot of use cases. Like, what could it possibly do for you if you don't kind of look and walk around like you might be a tech company? And then lastly, that AI only is going to make sense if you have a large scale data environment, that you need to have a lot of things to feed it if you're going to use it at all. Um, hopefully I haven't kind of given away the lead too much, but all these statements are almost as silly as the ones on the last slide. So we're all still here because most of the narratives that we get fed about AI aren't totally real, or they're true kind of in the abstract in a general sense, but when you actually get down to applying them to real world companies, these narratives don't really have to hold a lot of water. And just because one of these narratives is possible doesn't mean it's some sort of unavoidable destiny, or just because it can be imagined or seems to make sense doesn't mean that's actually what we see out in the world. And this here of, where is L&D at with AI? This here in terms of adoption might also perhaps not be what we've come to think. And in the interest of that, obviously I have some data on it, but I wanted to take a poll to see where we're at on this webinar today. Where do you think, regardless of where your particular organization is at, like what would you guess is the closest to the overall average for all types of businesses in terms of like how much of them have actually gotten on board? So is it A, 75% or more? Most are already there. They've been knocking at AI's door for a bit. It's only around half. So half are fraidy cats, half are embracing it. Is it only 25% of organizations that have injected AI into their L&D? Well, I mean, we're really still in the beginning of all this stuff. Or is it less than 10%? You know, AI stands for let's avoid integrations more than it does and anything else. And I see Liz has the poll up. Let's see. All right, so we had 6% thinking that it was 75% or more. Um, so people people can take the bait on that. 14% guessing that it's around half. Half of you thought it's around 25%, and a little less than a third said less than 10. So the answer to this, interestingly, most people actually got it right. The answer to this is that most organizations, like 25% of them, are are currently using AI in L&D, right? So this is the actual state of practice. Regardless of what we hear in media, like this is sort of where things stand right now. I mean, this is recent data um, that training industry pulled. Right now, the good news is if we look all the way to the left at, like those that will not adopt AI solutions and stuff like that, we're very few of them are acting like stubborn toddlers with vegetables, right? So there's less than 10% saying never and just refusing to engage with it. But the rest of us are all over the map, right? Like it's not all of us that have already embraced this and integrated it into our workflows and our daily processes. A lot of us are still exploring and kicking tires and seeing what's out there, seeing what it might do and how it might work. And I think some of the problem that we have in L&D is I mean, and looking at the chart, I've data on there for, where organizations are at just in general. Have they adopted AI anywhere versus have they done it in training? And I think we muddle these two narratives together a lot, or we assume that they're generally interdependent. That if a company has adopted AI for I don't know, like warehouse inventory or something like that, ergo it must be in training somehow. Um, and what's really close, or much closer to reality than the hyperbole that we hear splashed all over the place is this: only a quarter of companies are actively doing it. So it is certainly not everybody. But again, everyone else is somewhere on that continuum of trying to get there. And when we split all this down, this overall 25% that are using it regularly is just a snapshot. There's a lot of variation hiding out in the demographics of, like, well, what kind of companies are these? How big are they? Like, what are they trying to do with this? And that's the kind of thing that we're going to be diving into in all the slides that follow. Um, and for what we have on the screen here, some of the narratives that we're seeing in terms of, uh, how positive are some of these different ways you can slice and dice organizations. Like what is their general disposition to this? We're going to see some of these things crop up again and again, but we're also going to see things that seemingly contradict some of what these exact numbers suggest. But the overall patterns are that when it comes to organizational size, small businesses are no less likely to be using and testing AI for training than larger orgs. And in fact, looking at the numbers, it's the largest orgs that actually seem to be the least likely or have the least sunny disposition towards using AI in their training. When we look at industry, um, there's some patterns in here that aren't fully going to bear themselves out later. Like here, just based on who's using it, manufacturing is winning that horse race. Banking and finance places, and then finally, tech comes in third. And at the other end of the spectrum, education or I think it's more adult ed and stuff like that. They're the most suspicious, right? But the overall message is that if we're trying to keep up with the Joneses, it's easy to get a distorted picture of how common all this is as it stands today.
There was actually a really great question before you move on from this slide.
Yep.
Andy had asked, what does adopting mean and like using AI in training? So could you clarify on like those kind of two meanings? Like,
Yes. Yeah. So when and the way we phrase this question is it had to do with regular use. So if an organization was like using AI, but it wasn't kind of like this is the way we do this process now, or it's something they do with regularity, and it's like they have morphed that process. we didn't count that as actively using AI in training. So the quarter represents like the people that have actually leaned all the way in, versus those where maybe they know where they might like to use it, but they haven't fully stood that all the way up yet.
Perfect.
Hopefully that clarifies.
Yeah. And like, I think the follow-up question in creating training or for learners, I guess like using AI in training
Mm,
specifically, like what?
yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you asked that because we have slides on that for like where is it being used? What is it being used for? We'll get into that. But we're going to start with this first section. When does organizational size matter? And I think this is most top of mind to a lot of people. I think we carry the most assumptions based on organizational size. And so the narratives of size are kind of narratives about scale and scope. You know, like how many learners are you trying to serve? How complex is your existing operations and all that type of stuff. But the way I see it, there's kind of three questions, or at least three that we're going to talk about today that we have time for, about scale and scope. So, you know, does AI training kind of what that means? Does that get understood differently depending on how large or small of an organization we're talking about? Do learners react to it differently in large versus small organizations? And then lastly, do the use cases for AI change based on the size of the employee population? So hopefully we're going to answer all three of those questions in the slides that follow. So to begin with, defining what is in AI training, there's two slides for this. So on this slide, we're looking at like basic skill competencies. So, you know, more or less, do employees know how to use AI as a general tool? Is that something that's being provided? And what we can see from the data is that it's medium to large organizations that appear to be taking the broadest approach to competencies having to do with just kind of basic usage. Um, you know what was interesting, or I think most pronounced out of the slide. It's easy for it to be hiding, but if you look at the none of the above option on the bottom, the largest organizations are most likely to say we're not doing any of this. You know, so I think that's probably flip-flop from what most of us would assume. We would think, you know, surely it's the small organizations that are, you know, that have been left behind by all this. When in fact what we see is the opposite. The smallest organizations aren't running away from this. I mean, they're trying to train their employees on how to use these tools and use features, you know, inside things that they're already using just as much as you know the large organizations. So if you have 500 or you have 5,000, you're both, you know, the ball is in play, no matter kind of how large the company is. Now, again, this was just like basic skill competencies. When we get into kind of things that go a little bit deeper, you know, so like, do they not only know how to get an AI to spit out some sort of output, but can they also critically evaluate that output or the process and how AI might have altered that process? Those are the competencies that we're trying to look at here. You know, so things like, do employees know that AI can hallucinate? Do they have some grasp of the ethics of using AI or you know, protecting data security if you know they're dealing with IP from the parent organization, you know, like whatever it might be. You know, to what extent do they have a handle on that? And again, what we see is medium to large organizations are the ones casting the widest net. And the largest organizations are arguably the most narrow. But if we look at the average number of topics on the right side of the screen, you know, so this is like across both of this slide and the slide that we had just looked at. If we, you know, say, okay, how many things did people pick? It doesn't suggest that headcount equates to wildly different approaches to AI training. You know, maybe what is in there changes a little bit, but there isn't, you know, big companies are giving people this really expansive overview of what AI is and how to use it, and little companies are just giving people one or two breadcrumbs. It's kind of the same no matter where you look. Um, now I will say, kind of looking at the slide, it was arguably disappointing to see like the very large organizations least concerned with things like ethics and accuracy and security, you know, as well as being able to know when you're dealing with hallucinations and things like that. But also thought it was very interesting that the very largest organizations are also most likely to focus on understanding natural language processing than everyone else. So that kind of leads me to leave, maybe in those instances, some of those people are scratching their chin going, how do we build one of these for ourselves? Um, but still, it doesn't preclude smaller organizations from also addressing those topics or including that in what they train um, learners in terms of how are they interfacing with these tools. And speaking of learners, how do learners react to it? What we see here, kind of splitting like how, basically where do learner sentiments fall? Are they, do they welcome it with open arms, or are they pretty sure it's going to steal their job? Like where are they on that whole spectrum of emotion? Um, so while it's not universal, more often than not, it appears to be the largest organizations that are the most wary. Again, probably the opposite of what most of us would guess. But also looking at this data, to me, the I think the easy part of the story to miss, but to me one of the most important is what's happening on the extremes. We don't really have a ton of naysayers, no matter what the size of the organization is. And on on all the way on the right, where everything's happy-go-lucky, you have roughly the same proportion of fan clubbing across different organizational sizes. So in terms of how big or small you are, that isn't really going to move the needle a whole lot in terms of like, can you expect employees to have a more positive or negative sentiment? This data suggests that that's not really what is moving things around. And, so asking the next question, do the use cases for AI change based on the employee population? The story here is that size doesn't buy you a ticket to any of these use cases. Nobody is left out of any of these. And there's also a fair mixture between, AI that directly serves the learner through things like personalization, learner support and assistance, or coaching. And AI that indirectly sort of serves L&D staff, for things like tracking performance or help with creating content. Um, but again, there's nobody boxed out of using AI for any of these things, simply as a function of we're too big to do that, or we're too small for that use case to make sense for us. What we see across organizations is everybody's doing a little bit of everything. Um, Now here, there's some dips in the data, but a lot of differentiation on these use cases will follow the industry to much more dramatic effect, as we'll see a little bit later. Um, but digging into do the use cases change based on how large the company is? A little bit more. Looking at the average number of use cases across size, it's not, there's not really an exciting story here. This is probably not what most of us would have expected either. Like admittedly, these use cases look very different in practice. I mean, standing up an AI powered coaching program at an organization with 30,000 employees is a slightly different task than standing up something that provides learner support at an organization of 300, right? But the point here is that scale doesn't equate to some proliferation of multiple use cases, as we might assume that it does. Big or small, most organizations are tackling only a few of these things at once. So there's nobody out there using, or I mean, I don't want to say nobody, but you're not going to find lots of other organizations out there using AI for everything in training. Chances are good, two, three, maybe four on the high end. That is where most people are in terms of how many different things are they trying to do for their training using some sort of AI powered solution. So to try to wrap this section up, how much does headcount matter? Um, so to me, what the data tells us is that the largest organizations actually appear to be a little bit more hesitant with slightly narrower definitions of AI, slightly less enthusiastic learners, and on average, maybe one or two fewer use cases, right? Small organizations are using all this stuff too, so there's not really a reality that an enterprise is too tiny to engage with AI and training. But the sweet spot, if there is one, is medium and medium to large organizations. Now, all that said, these are trends and tendencies, not really stark differences, right? What we see in these numbers, if we take a step back from them, is the adoption of AI, regardless of the size of the company, right? So size isn't something that is punching someone's ticket or not into being able to bring these sort of technologies into employee training. All right, looking at time, I'm not doing awful. All right, so we'll get into the next section. When does the industry or the market of the organization matter? And just kind of like last time, what we're talking about are the narratives that we have. So, how broadly is AI training similar across industries? Does everybody look at it the same way? How do learners react to it across industries? Is that all the same? And are the use cases different across verticals? I sort of already foreshadowed that yes, they are different across verticals, but we're going to get there. All right. So to begin with, defining what is in AI training from the standpoint of basic skill competencies. Uh, Now, kind of different from the size story, we start to see some really pronounced differences based on the vertical an organization is in. Now that said, though, most competencies are generally endorsed. There's some standouts. Like for instance, technology is really hot on training how to use features inside some existing software solution. But we also see how different markets view AI differently. Like so, for instance, workflow integration is generally important, but less so if you're in retail or in adult education. AI and content creation kind of shows a similar pattern to that. Then elsewhere we see different patterns, such as manufacturing seeing less importance in hands-on training, or the opportunity for hands-on practice and training compared to other verticals. So here when we get to industry, we do start to see some things shake out. Um, like here when we get to knowledge and judgment competencies, um, like one of the first notes I made to myself was like, should it be alarming that healthcare wins none of these? That like understanding hallucinations, you know, looking at outputs for accuracy and relevance is like, why isn't healthcare winning all of these things? Um, but but that would be unfair to just single them out. Because it's not like they lose everything either. But there's some interesting things that pop out of this. Like I found it interesting that manufacturing seemingly cares most about hallucinations and bias. Tech cares most about privacy. I mean, that one sort of checks out. Banking and finance cares most about accuracy, right? And when we look at the chart on the right on the number of topics, I mean the technology firms kind of win. I don't know that surprises anybody that they would be most likely to have more topics than others. But what I thought was very notable and again easy to gloss over is everywhere else there's parity, right? No industry vertical on average is putting on blinders to what could be done, or what is the scope of what people need to know in order to work with these tools. What sort of things should we train our employees on to use these tools, whether they're making performance garments in a factory or they're doing electrical engineering. It's like, does that definition differ? This suggests no, most companies are going to put between five and six, maybe seven different topics into the bucket that they decide to call AI training. When we go again and look at how do learners react to it across industries, there are some differences here, but again, looking at the say the very leftmost side of the chart, to me, one of the stories is that you don't see lots of pushback. There's not one particular industry where all the holdouts live. Now, all that said, you can also look at the data and say, all right, tech is the warmest to AI. That's not really a shock at all that they would be the most open to it. But interesting, given the other data that we've seen, that healthcare comes in second. Because we know from the earlier usage data, they're not the highest adopters of it, but their learners are maybe more willing than other industry verticals to engage with it. Other things that kind of stood out from this data, education seems to be the most neutral on using AI, which I think, some of the narratives inside education, like academic dishonesty and people using AI to cheat at tests, all that sort of stuff. Maybe not surprising that they are maybe more neutral, but interesting though that like retail and banking and finance seem to be where more of the skeptics lie. And there's, again, very little uptake on uncertainty, no matter the vertical. So again, what these data are saying is most learners are on board. But as you go from industry to industry, you're going to have pockets of people that are holdouts, or or you might be in that one banking and finance organization where everyone is really wary of this, whereas your competitors are looking at it positively. They might have a totally different stance. So like that's some of the nuance that we're hoping kind of pulls out of some of these splits and looking at the data in this way. When we go on to, do the use cases for AI differ across verticals? Yes, there are clear use cases by industry. So, for instance, personalization is big in manufacturing. Automated insights, as well as personalization, seem to be a prominent use case in banking and finance. Tech is leaning more into learner support as how they're using AI in their training. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, there's also clearly unpopular use cases depending on industry. So in retail, they don't care about using AI for content creation. In education, they're not trying to track performance with it. Manufacturing, weirdly, not really using AI at all for translation and localization. Other markets, it's one of the things that they're tapping it for. And I think why this is important is for example, like we might hear a narrative that learning personalization is the next big thing. That's the next wave of what everybody's trying to do with AI. And that might be true for your business with a lot of emphasis on might, because if you're in one industry or another, maybe the personalization ship isn't ever really going to come to your harbor. Maybe where you're going to have success with applications of AI, it has nothing to do with personalizing stuff for the learner. Maybe it has everything to do with content, or everything to do with coaching. So the narratives I think that we hear about use cases, we have to remember that like, from industry to industry, some of those may have a leg to stand on, some of them may not. And I think that's why understanding some of the nuances and what's going on between organizations, I think helps us better ground our own view of what's going on with AI. Like what are the Joneses doing? How do I keep up with them? If we're aware that everything is not going to be the same in terms of the applications. And again, looking at the number of use cases across industry verticals. I mean, we saw a couple slides ago, the definition for AI training in tech might be, broader than everywhere else. But that said, they're not running a markedly higher number of use cases compared to other industries. So there are some places where maybe they're only using this in two places, but if you're in tech, if you're in banking and finance, if you're in manufacturing, it might be four. So again, sort of where you're coming from might have way more of a bearing on how many different places are you trying to use this, and where are you trying to bring it to bear in employee learning, rather than some, or looking at some just broad metric of, like, well, most companies are trying to do five things with this. It's like, if you're in tech, you might just, you might just be shooting par, versus if you're in, durable goods or retail or wholesale or something like that, and you're doing five, that's twice as many perhaps as your competitors. So what market you're coming from, I think makes a lot of difference in terms of like how you're thinking about the benchmarks and what they mean for your organization. All right, so to try to wrap up this section, like how much does industry matter? Hopefully you agree that industry appears to make a big difference insofar as how AI training might be defined, the breadth of that definition, and the extent to which learners are warmed to different applications of AI, and also how ultimately AI is being put to task in L&D. Now, I think it's important to push the conversation there, because I think whether AI is or isn't being used is not really where AI and training, like where that intersection stands right now. Like I think the nuts and bolts of where and how is where the real conversation lives. So it's less a do I turn this on or turn this off, and more of a where am I going to turn this on? For what am I going to try to use this for? All right, and let's I guess get on the road to wrapping this all up with what I think are the useful takeaways about the current reality of AI and L&D. Um, I mean, for one, I think we're always fighting deep misconceptions about AI and what it can do, and when we bring it into our organizations to try to improve performance or accelerate content creation, whatever it's for, are we really thinking about it the right way? Are our expectations realistic or not? So for instance, I think there's a lot of people that want to believe that AI acts as a plug and play solution. Like for example, I see talk commonly about like AI might replace content libraries, because why have a course on something if you can just ask an AI, you know? And relatedly, it's like, yeah, okay, I can ask ChatGPT for a story, so why would I ever watch a movie or read a book? If because the experience doesn't matter of what it is. It's like, no, the experience matters a whole lot. So how many times are you going to be able to just magically plug AI into stuff and you get great outcomes on the back end? It's probably not going to be that straightforward or that easy. Another misconception, I think, is that AI can quickly deliver ROI. As an example, we might be tempted to think, personalization is as easy as, you just have an AI. So magic happens in whammo. You can personalize your learning to learners. Whereas I think the truth is that you need some data architectures that can feed an AI and enable them to personalize learning for learners. And putting those data structures together are painful because they always have been. I don't think that's ever really going to change. And that particular pain isn't one that you can task an AI with because it's about capturing the context, right? Like AI helps with what's on the other side of that hill. Doesn't necessarily help you kind of get up the first bit of it. Like you still have to do the work for figuring out how is ROI defined? What do I have around that I can use to measure that? What format do I need to present that, to various stakeholders? Does everybody define it the same way? Like an AI is not going to magically, help you beat your way out of that jungle. Like you have to forge the path. An AI can help, but it's not by itself going to just magically deliver you outcomes. Another misconception that I've feel like I'm absolutely not the only person saying this, but it bears repeating is that, you can trust AI as a subject matter expert. Um, and I mean, it's depending on how much experience you have with it, like, I mean, it can be comically wrong sometimes. But I think more to the point is, like human touch is hard to replicate. And AI is just simply not there. I mean, heck, like good human touch is hard to replicate for us, and we're humans. And AI is super awkward and frankly still kind of dumb at trying to replicate that or make things engaging or get stuff correct and be accountable for that accuracy. So at least the way we see it, AI can do a lot, but it's a terrible stand-in for a subject matter expert. You need a SME. A SME with an AI can do a whole lot, but just all by itself, an AI isn't. It might get you part of the way there, but it'll give you some fun wrong answers on the route. One of the last misconceptions I wanted to touch on is that the rollout of an AI is somehow unique in L&D, that it's this new thing that we have to make up some way to attack it and get it into our processes. And I'd like to say that I don't know how much that is true. Like I feel like a lot of organizations, you probably already have a playbook for rolling out a software. And while this is different, the route for how you roll it out is more familiar than we might realize, right? Like we think AI is one thing that can do all this different stuff. But yet like we don't treat a lot of other things like that. Or like we don't you open multiple tabs in a browser. You don't just open one browser and go, how come it's not doing everything I need it to do, just in one tab? Like we use it for different things, so why wouldn't we be better off with the idea of a specialized AI that does specific tasks rather than kind of one all-knowing HAL 9000 thing that we have to roll with. Like we're rolling out a software, we're rolling out a feature. Yes, maybe how we're asking employees to think about that feature or use that piece of software is a little bit more involved than an HRIS or something like that. But how you get it out there is kind of the same as a software rollout. Like so how we even would approach pushing things out there, we might think like, oh, it's this new scary endeavor, and it's not. We probably already know how to do it. Um, and then I think the last misconception that it's easy for a lot of people to have is that stakeholders and employees tend to be on opposite sides of the AI coin. That there's this constant tension between leaders and frontline people on should we, shouldn't we, and kind of where does everything stand. And before we get to some data on that, I wanted to take another poll and ask how open are your senior leaders or stakeholders to implementing AI and employee training? So are they very open? Like you can tell by their emails that they write them with AI. Are they somewhat open? So it's more of a vibe than it is a certainty that you're going to use AI. Are they not at all open because they're scared it's going to steal everything from us? Or are you not sure because they're not sure either? And let's see, I didn't ramble as long reading those responses. So let's leave it open for a little bit longer. All right, let's see. We got about 70 people. So 41% said very open, 43% said somewhat open, only 3% said not at all, and 13% said not sure. All right. So what's interesting is I asked this same poll a month ago, and the results were almost the same. 41% the last time said very open, or I'm sorry, 41% said this time very open. 36 last time. About half of people said somewhat open. This time it was 43. So the numbers are fairly on. The last time I think it was 5% said not at all. This time it was only 3%. So again, the story seems to be there's not lots of opposition. It's more sort of where do we fall? And in terms of what our data told us when we asked how open are stakeholders to increasing the use of AI enhanced training, over the next year, 58% of them said they were at least moderately open. And what we found, kind of looking at this data cross with learner data that I think is very noteworthy, is that the crosswalk kind of tends to follow the same tides. I mean, it doesn't follow it perfectly, but when you have stakeholders that are open to using AI, employee attitudes tend to follow. When you have employees that are a little bit more resistant to AI, you tend to see the same thing reflected in stakeholders. So there's so usually if a company is kind of pro or con AI, that is more like one big globby unit sort of sharing that opinion, rather than you have just totally opposing camps between leadership and employees. Um, and so yeah, this crosswalk isn't perfect, though. You are going to have isolated cases where everyone's not on the same page, but I think everyone generally has their eyes kind of open to the same thing, like because this adoption isn't only an IT exercise. It isn't solely a culture change exercise. It's not just a skills gap analysis. It can be all of those things rolled into one, or you can pick and choose what parts you want to apply AI to and what parts you want to hold back. But I think no matter sort of what you're putting together, um, I think the important parts are thinking about who is involved in this, right? So like I've talked about learners, learning leaders, and stakeholders very, very much on purpose, because the real life story of using AI training at your organization is about all of those actors all together. Like AI and employee learning doesn't happen in a vacuum where the only person that has to deal with it at all is the learners. There's a whole political, cultural context that all this stuff has to exist in and function. And still, even within that openness to stakeholders, there's a little bit of variation. And so, yes, the variation's there, but still the overarching story is that nobody is totally closed off, right? At least not because of the industry they hail from. So if you're in technology, yeah, your stakeholders are probably fairly open to it, most likely. But we saw from the usage data is that where we're seeing the highest adoption rates? Not necessarily. So all of this is sort of a bit of a mix, right? So if we're going to go and try to talk about like what are the big picture overall takeaways, I think it would be that, through the lens of organizational size, number of employees is a bad way to look at what you can expect with AI applications, right? Like if anything, the middle market is where things are happening. So the idea that like, ooh, because I feel like a lot of people do this with other organizational practices. It's like, ooh, what is Apple doing or what is Google doing? It's like, I would argue the middle market is actually where you want to look for the innovations. Um, and also that there are relatively few pockets of opposition, kind of no matter where you look. There's not a lot of there's people that haven't gotten on board yet, but there isn't a lot of people saying never. Also across industries, we see a lot of differing definitions of kind of what goes into AI training, what the needs might be, what the use cases are for why are they engaging with AI. Learners aren't going to be universally warm to the idea, neither are stakeholders. Um, but also I think looking at all this as a continuum versus sort of this like a yes/no dichotomy, um, kind of gives us insight into what differentiates businesses from one another, right? Because the point of all this is to point out that depending on where you are, the challenges and the inroads, could be different. If you're in manufacturing, more of your competitors might already be on board with using AI in training. But maybe your stakeholders aren't as warm and your learners might not be the most excited. If you're in, X industry, story changes, perhaps only slightly, but there isn't, and this is sort of the overarching thing, there isn't one big correct answer for everyone to listen to, right? And we need to take into account learners, stakeholders, the business context, and so on, when we're trying to decide what is the AI strategy for our organization, right? So hopefully the data that we've gone over can help us map out a little bit of what to expect, what's commonplace or what's deceptively rare, for whatever the type of business we might be in, and what use cases that we might want to chase down or lean into chasing down more fully. Because the answer can't simply be to just swing around wildly at everything and anything while hoping that something sticks, right? Because AI is too expensive for us to do that. We need to have a handle on what matters, what doesn't, and most importantly, what matters specifically to us in the N of one business that we're in. All right, before I turn it over to Lindsay at Adobe for a few words, I wanted to point out that training industry has a bunch of AI resources. A lot of what you've heard today came out of this combination of ebooks that we have available. We also have top training company lists of different AI providers. Be reticent is the right word, reticent to point out that Adobe is one of the top AI content creation and authoring tools companies. We have a few certificates. We also have our own AI that we painfully trained named Tia inside our membership. So in terms of, if you need more information, between training industry and Adobe, we have resources available for you. And with that, I'm gonna mute for at least a second, take a drink, and let Lindsay talk for a sec.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tom. It was really interesting to learn more about AI adoption by topic and industry. And one of the things that you ended on, I really liked a lot, which was thinking about AI as a continuum where that application really takes on relevancy in the journey based on use case. I think that's, a lot of what we're seeing as well, and how organizations are going about applying AI to their learning journeys. So by the way, I'm Lindsay Dawkins, and I'm from Adobe. I'm a solutions consultant with the organization and around digital learning. And we wanted to share a little bit more about how Adobe Learning Manager is working to reimagine the learner experience to meet some of these new realities. So, I'm thinking about this a lot in terms of what's happening in learning right now is actually mirroring some of the shift that we're seeing with tools like ChatGPT. So people used to really kind of start with a course, go learn something. Now they are starting more with a question. I think our mentalities have been reframed a little bit. So they're expecting to be able to type or speak a natural language prompt and receive that kind of clarity, guidance, context that goes along with the learning journey. And some of what we're seeing is that it means, not only is it becoming more conversational, but it's also becoming more iterative. Where we used to kind of come in and take something and be done. Now we're asking more questions based on what we've learned and expecting to be able to find those answers. So Adobe's been working to kind of bring that same intuitive discovery process into the learning ecosystem to be able to transform it from more of that kind of scavenger hunt to a guided experience that's becoming more adaptive and starting with a question and actually not ending with like an answer, but ending with more confidence. And I think that's what we're working to bring to bear here. So this slide is just illustrating a little bit around a learning journey example. So on the top, you think about kind of present day. You're seeing maybe you're preparing something for maybe a customer meeting, a product demo. And in doing that, you're researching pitch decks. You might be watching a full-length recording of something because you're having trouble kind of finding where that right sweet spot is. Maybe you're jumping out of your LMS into YouTube, you're asking ChatGPT, you're going to a webinar, maybe you're asking your manager for feedback or a practice session. There's sort of all of these disparate inputs that we've all gotten used to in terms of trying to find answers. But what it kind of comes down to is that it's not that our content is bad. There's this inefficiency around finding it and iterating on it and believing in it. And I think, right, learners are spending a lot of time searching. They're not quite sure what's relevant. We talked a little bit about hallucinations. They're not sure if it's real, if it's coming from something like ChatGPT. And they're finishing and they're still not actually sure how to apply it. So this is one of the experiences that Adobe Learning Manager is looking to redesign for the learner. And we're only really kind of talking about the learner side today. But some of the applications that we're seeing and working on are kind of one, being able to ask for help naturally. So thinking about this concept of the personal tutor, right? Instead of hunting for content, using the libraries, using filters, you might actually just want to ask a question like, based on the context up top, hey, help me prepare for a meeting with a retail customer that I'm having in the Midwest. And the AI might come back instead of just giving you an answer like, oh, here's the training to take, to iterate on that and say, what kind of meeting is it? What's the product that you're working on? What's your experience level with learning that product? And it can start to understand intents, roles, regional context, performance. So it's more like what's happening when you're prompting an AI versus what's happening when you're searching a catalog. Two, I think we're seeing more around this sort of idea of instant and personalized learning. Tom talks some about recommendations and how that works and what our expectations are. What we're working to do is to have AI be able to, not sort of just serve you that automated learning path, but work to take that information that you've put together and create a tailored learning path automatically. And this is not just about sort of creating an IDP, right? We all have been through that process of development plan and career-based. But what we're looking to do is to be able to not only do that, but take information from things like, maybe chorus notes, maybe Gong, maybe Salesforce activity, and actually start to work with that information to create something that is contextual and prepared just for you, leveraging that AI output. Next is thinking about, okay, we've had this conversation. Now we've learned something, hopefully. How do we assess those skills and continue again to iterate on that and learn? And Adobe Learning Manager is using what we're calling Skills Assessor, which will help to be able to actually create insights for the learner. So not only are they taking training, but now they're starting to practice their pitch. They're understanding more about things like objection handling, getting feedback on that in real time with real measurable behaviors. Content builder. So, this is, I think Tom talked a little bit about this as well, and we got some questions. Where is content coming from? And, how are we creating that content, both as administrators, How are we curating that content? And also, how are we generating content by learners? So part of what Content Builder is trying to do is to bring those things together, where it's understanding the learner needs, creating things like scenario-based microlearning, product updates or briefings that can take contextualized information, um, or even asking for content, right? We don't have this. How do we fill this gap? And then last is thinking about something like an AI coach. I think probably a lot of people are seeing this in the learning management sort of system ecosystem, that there's this ask for how do we practice these skills in a safe space. So this is one of the things that sort of closing the journey on is thinking about, okay, again, you've been through this learning journey, you've received feedback from the skills assessor, you've been able to build something that's personalized, but taking this kind of to a level where it's very comfortable, allowing you to iterate and build confidence through repetition, to get instant feedback from an AI coach, and to prepare for those interactions without kind of having to be vulnerable as much as we all love to, be embarrassed in front of our boss or our peers. It is much easier to be a little embarrassed in front of AI and be able to hone that game. So I'll kind of close that out with, thinking about the transformation is not just about kind of plugging in AI to learning. And again, I think Tom really hit the nail on the head with that. It's like, it's not just something that's out there that's a panacea. It's something that plugs into different aspects of that learner journey, different aspects of that administration journey, and helps you to be able to discover, practice, and contextualize what's going on in the space, and become a little bit, again, a little bit more advanced, a little bit more personalized, a little bit more supportive as we continue through that journey. So again, we just wanted to give you a little bit of a kind of teaser about how we're thinking about this at Adobe, and what the vision is. I think you're going to see all kinds of new directions in terms of how LMSs, how CMSs, how creation tools are approaching this, and this is sort of how we're looking at it in terms of the different aspects that affect the journey. So I'll go ahead and close with that. I think Tom, did you? Or Liz?
Yeah. Yeah, cool. Thank you for that, Lindsay.
Absolutely.
So yeah, that more or less wraps up all the content we had today in this session. Hopefully it gave you some helpful information for wherever you're at with your own AI journey, whether you're still early in the game or comparatively seasoned, as much as that's a thing from looking at the usage data. And I feel like if it felt difficult for you to pencil in the dotted lines between the data and your journey, I'd like to echo something that Lindsay just said, that I think it's easy to forget that when we invoke AI, we're not talking about one thing. AI doesn't have one impact. It can show up a whole lot of different ways. It's going to have different challenges depending on what we're trying to do with it. And what matters is the strategy underneath our practices, and whether that strategy is thoughtful and informed, or panicked and 100% shooting from the hip, right? Because a foundation of strategy of wide-eyed, okay, this is what we're going into. Here's where it might fail. Here's the successes we're expecting. If you have that strategy, you're going to better your odds of success, regardless of the particular AI recipe that you're cooking up for learners, and regardless of how big or small the business is and what industry that it's in. I mean, I think hopefully the data here showed everybody that big or small, no matter what vertical you're in, you can get on board with AI, and what you do with it doesn't have to be the same as what other people are doing with it. And with that, I should shut up. I think we only have a couple minutes, Liz.
No worries. We did have a couple of questions, but if we don't address those, of course, you're more than welcome to reach out. We will be reaching out as well to address those. But I thought one was really interesting, and then I apologize, Dana. You sent a lot of information, so I'm going to try to sum it up. But she was just curious if you found any user demographic data on adapting to AI. And why she asked is when her colleague ran a survey, they found that 40-year-old and over are more willing to adapt than the younger workforce, and thought that was counterintuitive, and was intrigued if you had any information.
I do, and I'm like, I only have a minute to stand on this soapbox. I got to make it quick. So to me, one of the industries, it goes back to, like, digital natives versus digital immigrant, whatever the phrases are for it. You know, like people that are younger that were born into a world full of all this tech versus those of us that are a little bit older, you know, that had to learn all this stuff and like start with, you know, basic load asterisk comma 8 comma 1 commands way back when. And one of the things that I've seen some lab research find is that it's a matter of mindset rather than like familiarity or skill with a particular tool. So this is just on average, like younger people, when they learn a piece of technology, they will see it as having it's a tool. It has that purpose, that function. I think those of us that are older, we have, or kind of maybe as we came along, we had fewer things thrown to us with the claim that this is a Swiss Army knife that will do everything you need it to do. You know, you'd get a tool for one thing and people would figure out other uses for, you know, so it's the same way as like thinking about a screwdriver. Like, yes, you can use a screwdriver to turn a screw. It can also be a lever. You can use it as a hammer. You know, you can use it as a whole bunch of different things. And so older learners or some people maybe with a more varied experience with technology, I think are more comfortable approaching a tool and like turning it upside down and going, what else can I use this for? Whereas, and this is, granted, this isn't a universal truth, but it's this pattern that older learners are more likely to do that, whereas younger learners will search for a tool that solves the problem they need solved. And if that tool doesn't do it, they're going to look for another tool rather than say, how can I use this one tool I already have a little bit differently to get the outcome that I want? So like from a like I've seen enough of that sort of stuff in the research where I don't feel foolish saying all that kind of thing out loud on a webinar.
No worry, we are out of time, but as a Gen Z person here, I will testify and agree to some extent. But thank you both so much for this presentation. Like I said, we are out of time, so I don't want to take up anyone else's time for today, but thank you both for walking us through all that good information. I feel like I learned something, so I hope everyone else did as well. And for again, those questions that we did not address, we will be reaching out, so don't worry there. But additionally, we have a busy week this month. So if you want to check out more webinars this month, you can register for these now and you can watch past webinars. If you really like this one, you can even go back and watch this one again if you like at trainingindustry.com. And all of our webinars are pre-qualified for a credit hour by HRCI, SHRM, ISPI, and CBTM. So if you need those codes, send anybody an email asking for those because they'll forward it to me anyway, but pretty much reach out and we will give you those codes. And if I said CPTM and you were like, what is that, Liz? It is the Certified and Professional and Training Management Program that assists you in developing core competencies that will empower you to manage the future training needs of your organization. So you can find more information at trainingindustry.com/training. And I would love to meet you all here in Raleigh, North Carolina for our 2026 Training Industry Conference and Expo. TICE is where learning leaders like you gather to forge new professional connections. We learn from each other and we address our most pressing learning challenges. Additionally, you can save $400 off if you book it before December 31st. So totally check that out as well. Lastly, that evaluation survey should have popped open another tab in your browser, and we would greatly to hear your feedback from today's session. Thank you again to our amazing speaker, Tom, but more importantly, our amazing sponsor, Adobe. And lastly, I do thank you all for your time and attention today. I hope you have a wonderful day, a wonderful week, and I will see you all very soon. Bye, everybody.